Hello, my name is Becky Oliver. This is my running project proposal for Sped Class 756. The policy that I am examining is TAC 89.63, which is Instructional Arrangements and Settings. This policy is listed in our CROWLEY ISD handbook and on the website, and it states that the policy should be based on the individual needs of the IEP of eligible students receiving special education services. This includes mainstream, homebound, hospital class, speech therapy, resource, self-contained, off-home campus, non-public day school, vocational adjustment class, residential care and treatment facility, state-supported living center, and other programs approved by the Texas Education Agency. When I looked on the CROWLEY ISD website, it says most of the same information, has a little bit of different verbiage, but it talks about how FAPE must include the alternative placements listed in IDEA federal regulations and the SBOE and commissioner rules, and that FAPE must be provided in the least restrictive environment appropriate for students with the primary consideration given to the general education classroom and curriculum. I challenge this a little. I'm not sure that our district is meeting that necessarily, but we can talk more about that in a little bit. It also talks about CROWLEY ISD making sure that students with disabilities have available to them the variety of educational programs and services that are available to non-disabled students. And the following list is just an example of those same instructional arrangements that were listed earlier, which kind of seems to me like a continuum or a spectrum, which I think if we look at LRE, we want to kind of gear away from a continuum or a placement necessarily. When looking at different references in regards to this topic, per the School Leader's Guide to Special Education book, it states that IDEA requires that students with disabilities be educated in the least restrictive environment and with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. In my observation, as a teacher in CROWLEY for 20 years, I've observed many IEP meetings where placement decisions have been made. I will say there are times when it seems like a decision of placement had been made prior to the IEP meeting among administrators and or diagnosticians, and I'd like to see this change, especially at the elementary and middle school level. I think decisions should have more people involved, especially teachers and the parents. An interview I did with Stephanie Hartman. She is a CROWLEY ISD Special Education Coordinator. When asked how placement is determined for special education students in CROWLEY, she stated placement is determined by the ARD committee based on the present level and the goal of the student. CROWLEY ISD works hard to ensure that each student is served in the least restrictive environment. Thus, the default setting would be mainstream with supports in the general ed classroom. For students with needs that can't be met in the general education setting, the IEP committee weighs potential harmful effects of removal. For our self-contained settings, prior to the ARD, data is gathered by a specialist and shared with a coordinator who makes a recommendation for placement if needed. While the final say comes from the IEP committee, having these safeguards helps ensure proper placement decisions. When asked, do you think placement decisions in our district honor the least restrictive environment, she stated yes, that the district has worked really hard over the past few years to improve the work we do related to LRE. It's required a lot of culture change on the part of campuses to understand what true inclusion is and how it should work. When discussing my course and that LRE and inclusion have, it's been stated that they should not be considered places or classrooms, but instead a student should carry all of their supports and services with them wherever they go. I asked, do you think our district follows this idea? She stated, "I think we're working really hard to get there. There's still a lot of resistance to the idea that students with more significant needs can be served in a more inclusive setting. Students with learning disabilities are being included more and more, but we have more work to do for the lower incidence disabilities." And I do agree with that. When asked if there were any changes or improvements that she think we need to implement, she said yes. For our students on an alternate curriculum, I feel we have a lot of work to do to include them in more general education elective opportunities. We do a better job of this at the high school level, but a poor job at the middle school and elementary level. And my last question for her was asking if she sees any instances of disproportionality in any of our special education programs. And she stated that African American males are disproportionately represented in our disciplinary placements and behavioral programs. Another reference that I used for this presentation was the article, "Does Access Matter? Time in General Education and Achievement for Students with Disabilities." In that article, it stated that there's a positive correlation between the amount of time students with disabilities have access to general education curriculum and the scores of their reading and math achievement. And I feel like this is a good indicator of why we need to be involving our students in general education more and more. So based on that positive correlation, I believe that my district has some work to do in regards to how placement decisions are made and least restrictive environment. Instead of thinking of least restrictive environment as a spectrum of settings, my district needs to show LRE as the supports and services that students need, regardless of where they're getting these services. I think there are several ways that my district can improve on initial placement and providing more general education opportunities for our students. My recommendations include teachers in the Child Find Committee and to assist making placement decisions, implement the SWIFT model, start using universal design learning to start a culture of including all students at the elementary and middle school levels, and to include students with disabilities in more general education settings. As far as my action plan, I put my recommendations and then little action plans underneath each one. So to include teachers in the Child Find Committee and to assist making placement decisions, I would like to see them add members to the Child Find Committee. Right now it's comprised of mainly diagnosticians and special education administration. I'd like to add members comprised of teachers as well as administrators to that. I feel like they have a good understanding of the students on their campuses and what placements would be best. I'd also like for them to provide professional development to all committee members on non-discriminatory evaluation and LRE. As far as the SWIFT model, that's an education model that I think would really be beneficial for my district. I think as far as the action plans, researching the SWIFT model and proposing implementation starting at the elementary and middle school levels would be a great place to start. Also, scheduling professional development, training, coaching, and mentoring with the SWIFT education model personnel. Also, another recommendation was to include students with disabilities in more general education settings, including electives. Action plan would require that during IEP meetings, we should discuss more general education options for our students. And when creating student schedules, we should encourage general education electives. Continuing the action plan, start using universal design learning to start a culture of including all students at the elementary and middle school levels. So the steps for this would be to provide professional development training on universal design learning for all teachers, to visit schools or districts that are using UDL and discuss how it's working for them, create a UDL committee to plan how to start implementation of UDL in Crowley ISD, Implement the concept of station learning as seen in the video about Henderson Inclusion Elementary School. And collect data to monitor student academic progress before, during, and after the school year when UDL has been implemented. Here is a list of my references that I use for this PowerPoint, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.